Welcome to Eldermere Nights. If you enjoy relaxing bedtime stories and peaceful journeys to help you sleep, please subscribe and join us for many more quiet nights. Now, find a comfortable position and allow the day to slowly fade away. Tonight, we travel to the distant village of Avelune, where a lonely lighthouse stands above the sea, guiding travelers through the darkness. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let the sound of the waves carry you gently into tonight's story. Our journey begins beyond the cliffs. Long ago, on the western edge of an old kingdom, there stood a quiet coastal village called Avelune. The village rested between green hills and towering white cliffs that overlooked the endless sea. Far from the busy roads of merchants and kings, Avelune lived by the rhythm of the tides. The people there rose with the sunrise, worked beside the ocean, and rested beneath the sound of waves. Travelers rarely found the village by accident, and those who did often stayed longer than they intended, for there was a peacefulness in Avelune that seemed untouched by time. The cliffs surrounding the village rose high above the sea. Their white stone glowed softly beneath the moon and reflected the golden colors of sunset. Below them, gentle waves rolled endlessly against the rocks. Seabirds drifted upon the wind, and sea mist often climbed slowly upward from the water. From the edge of the cliffs, one could see miles of open ocean stretching toward the horizon. Especially at night, the sea seemed endless, as though it continued beyond the world itself. At the highest point of the cliffs stood an ancient lighthouse. Its stone walls had endured countless storms. Its narrow windows faced the sea, and its great lantern shone each night above the dark water. The lighthouse had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Some said it had guided ships for hundreds of years. Others believed it had always been there, watching, waiting, protecting those who crossed the sea. Every evening, just after sunset, the great lantern was lit. Its warm light slowly turned above the ocean. Far out at sea, sailors watched for it. Fishermen returning home followed it, and travelers resting in the village often stood quietly upon the cliffs, watching the beams sweep across the water. The light never hurried. It simply moved steadily through the darkness, again and again, night after night. The cottages of Avelune sat beneath the cliffs. Their roofs were covered with weathered tiles. Small gardens grew beside stone walls. Fishing boats rested in the harbour, and lanterns glowed warmly inside windows after sunset. The villagers lived simple lives. They respected the sea. They listened to the weather. and they trusted the lighthouse above them. For as long as anyone could remember, its light had never failed. Among the people of Avelune lived a quiet young boy. Each evening he climbed the hills outside the village and sat facing the sea. He watched the lighthouse as darkness fell. He watched its beam move slowly across the waves. And he wondered about the person who climbed the tower every night to keep the lantern burning. The boy's name was Elias, and though he did not yet know it, his life would one day become forever connected to the lighthouse above the cliffs. Elias had grown up beside the sea for as long as he could remember. From his earliest days, he could hear the waves outside his cottage window. The sound of the ocean became part of his life. It greeted him each morning, and it sang softly to him each night. While other children played in the village streets, Elias often wandered alone along the cliffs. He enjoyed the quiet. He enjoyed the wind. And above all, he loved watching the distant horizon where the sea met the sky. Every evening, Elias watched the lighthouse lantern begin its slow journey across the dark water. He wondered who lit the great light, how many years it had stood upon the cliffs, and how many sailors had followed it safely home. He often asked the villagers about it. Some shared old stories. Others simply smiled and said that the lighthouse had always been there. The answers never satisfied him. Instead, they only made him more curious. The lighthouse was cared for by an elderly keeper named Thomas. His beard had turned silver long ago. His hands were rough from years of work, and his eyes seemed to hold the calmness of the sea itself. The villagers respected him greatly. He rarely spoke loudly. He moved slowly and carefully. And each evening, without fail, he climbed the lighthouse stairs to light the great lantern. Many children feared the old tower, but Elias did not. He watched it with wonder. One autumn afternoon, Elias finally gathered enough courage to walk to the lighthouse. The sea wind moved gently across the cliffs. The old wooden door stood slightly open. Inside, he found Thomas carefully cleaning the lantern glass. The old keeper looked up and smiled. "Have you come to see the light?" he asked. Elias nodded quietly, and for the first time he stepped inside the ancient tower. Thomas led the boy upward through the narrow spiral staircase. Stone walls surrounded them. The sound of the sea echoed through small windows. Step after step, they climbed higher. At last, they reached the lantern room. The entire ocean stretched before them. The cliffs below looked small. The village seemed peaceful and distant. and above everything, the sky felt endless. Elias had never seen the world from such a height. As the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, Thomas lit the great lantern. Warm golden light filled the room. Moments later, the beam began turning across the dark sea. Elias watched silently. Something deep inside him awakened. For the first time, he understood why the lighthouse mattered. It was not simply a tower. It was a guide, a protector, a quiet promise in the darkness. And as the light moved slowly over the waves, a dream began to grow within him. One day, perhaps, he too would become a keeper of the light. After his first visit, Elias returned to the lighthouse whenever he could. The old keeper, Thomas, always welcomed him. Sometimes they sat quietly near the lantern room windows. Sometimes they watched the waves below. And sometimes they simply listened to the wind moving around the tower. Elias rarely spoke much, but he watched everything. He watched how Thomas cared for the lantern, how he cleaned the glass, how he checked the oil, and how he prepared the light each evening before sunset. One afternoon, Thomas handed Elias a small cloth. "Every light requires care," he said softly. Together, they cleaned the brass fittings of the lantern. They polished the glass until it shone. They checked the gears that slowly turned the great light. Thomas explained that the lighthouse did not guide ships because it was large or powerful. It guided them because it never failed. Night after night, year after year, always present, always waiting. As they worked, Thomas often shared stories. He spoke of great storms that had passed through Avelune. He spoke of sailors who had found their way home by following the light. He spoke of ships that appeared only as tiny shadows in the fog. And he spoke of lonely nights when the sea and sky became one. Elias listened carefully. The stories were never frightening. They were quiet, gentle, filled with patience and understanding. Every sunset, before lighting the lantern, Thomas rang a small brass bell. Its soft sound drifted across the cliffs. The villagers below had heard it for many years. For them, it meant that night had arrived. For fishermen, it meant it was time to return home. And for Elias, it became the sound of peace. He began waiting for the bell each evening. Its gentle tone felt as comforting as the waves below. One evening, while watching the sun disappear beyond the sea, Elias asked a question. "Why do you keep the light every night?" Thomas remained silent for a moment. Then he smiled. "Because someone may need it." He looked toward the horizon.
We may never know who sees the light. We may never meet them. But the light must still shine. Elias remembered those words. They settled quietly inside his heart.
As the weeks passed, the lighthouse became part of Elias's life. He helped carry supplies. He cleaned the windows. He climbed the tower stairs beside Thomas. And every evening, he watched the great beam travel across the sea. The dream inside him grew stronger. The cliffs, the lantern, the endless ocean, the quiet work of the keeper. All of it began to feel like home. And though many years still lay ahead, Elias could already feel that his future waited somewhere high above the sea, inside the lighthouse beyond the cliffs. One autumn morning, Thomas received news that an old friend in a nearby coastal village had become ill. The journey would take several days. For the first time in many years, the old keeper would need to leave the lighthouse. The villagers were surprised. The lighthouse had never stood without Thomas. As the sun began to set, the old keeper climbed the tower with Elias beside him. The lantern room glowed softly in the evening light. Outside, the sea remained calm. Thomas looked toward Elias. His eyes were kind and calm. "I need someone to watch the light," he said. Elias was silent. His heart began to beat faster. The old keeper placed a hand upon his shoulder. "You know the work. You know the tower. And most importantly, you respect the light." The young boy nodded slowly. For the first time in his life, the responsibility of the lighthouse rested upon him. That evening, Thomas left the village. His small figure slowly disappeared along the coastal road. The villagers watched quietly. As darkness approached, Elias climbed the spiral staircase alone. The familiar stone steps felt different now. The tower felt larger. The silence felt deeper. Above him waited the lantern room, and beyond it, the endless sea. Elias carefully prepared the lantern exactly as Thomas had taught him. He cleaned the glass. He checked the oil. He adjusted the mechanism. Then, as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, he lit the flame. Warm golden light filled the room. Moments later, the great lantern began its slow turning above the ocean. The beam stretched across the dark water, steady, calm, faithful. The lighthouse was alive once more. The night grew quiet. Far below, the village lights glowed beside the harbor. The waves moved gently against the cliffs. The wind whispered around the tower. Elias sat beside the window and watched the ocean. For the first time, he understood the loneliness of the keeper. But he also understood its peace. High above the world, surrounded by stars and sea, he felt strangely calm. Near midnight, Elias stepped outside onto the narrow balcony. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark ocean. Far away, he thought he saw the small lights of a distant ship. Perhaps someone was following the lantern home. Perhaps someone far beyond the horizon was trusting the light. Elias smiled softly, and beneath the stars above Avelune, he realized something. For one quiet night, he had become the keeper of the light. Several days passed after Thomas left the village. Elias continued caring for the lighthouse each evening. The work had become familiar. The lantern was cleaned, the oil was checked, and every sunset the great light began its slow journey across the sea. Then one morning, a thick fog arrived from the ocean. It moved quietly across the water. By afternoon, the harbour had disappeared behind the mist. The cliffs themselves seemed to vanish. Only the sound of waves remained. As evening approached, the fog grew heavier. The sea could no longer be seen from the village. Fishing boats remained in the harbour. The villagers spoke softly as they watched the white mist surround the cliffs. Even the lighthouse appeared like a shadow above the clouds. Elias climbed the tower as the first darkness arrived. Inside the lantern room, everything felt still. Outside, the world had disappeared. Elias lit the lantern. The great beam turned slowly through the fog. Its golden light cut across the white darkness. Sometimes the beam disappeared completely. Then it returned again. Steady, patient. The lighthouse continued its work exactly as it always had. Though the sea could not be seen, the light continued searching for ships beyond the mist. As the fog grew thicker, Elias remembered something Thomas had once told him. During heavy mist, the old brass bell should be rung. He climbed down the stairs and pulled the rope beside the tower entrance. The bell rang softly across the cliffs. Its sound drifted through the fog. Again and again. A quiet voice in the darkness, guiding anyone who might be listening. Near midnight, Elias noticed something. Far beyond the fog, a small light appeared. Then another, and another. Ships. Their lanterns glowed faintly through the mist. Slowly, they moved toward the lighthouse.
following its beam, following the sound of the bell. One by one, they safely entered the harbour. The villagers watched from below in silence. By morning, the fog began to disappear. The sea returned. The cliffs emerged once more. Several sailors visited the village before continuing their journeys. They spoke of the lighthouse. They spoke of the bell. And they thanked the unseen keeper who had guided them through the night. Elias said very little. He simply looked toward the tower. For the first time, he truly understood what Thomas had meant. The light was not only a lantern, it was hope. And somewhere beyond the sea, there would always be someone searching for it. As autumn slowly passed, winter came to Avelune. Cold winds arrived from the northern sea. The cliffs became white with frost. The harbour grew quiet, and the waves below the lighthouse became stronger than before. The villagers prepared their homes for the long season ahead. Firewood was gathered. Windows were sealed against the wind, and warm lanterns glowed behind every cottage window. High above them all, the lighthouse continued to watch over the sea. After many days away, Thomas returned to Avelune. The villagers welcomed him warmly. Elias was happy to see the old keeper once again. Together, they climbed the lighthouse stairs. Thomas listened carefully as Elias spoke about the fog, the ships, and the ringing of the bell. The old man smiled. "You kept the light well," he said. Those simple words meant more to Elias than anything else. One evening, dark clouds gathered above the ocean. The wind became stronger. Rain began to fall against the tower windows. Far below, the sea crashed against the cliffs. The villagers remained inside their homes. Fishing boats stayed safely in the harbour. And above the storm, the lighthouse lantern continued to turn. The great beam moved steadily through the rain and darkness. The storm grew stronger as the night continued. The tower shook softly beneath the force of the wind. Rain struck the glass. The sea roared below. Yet Thomas remained calm. Elias stood beside him in the lantern room. Together they watched the light sweep across the storm. Again and again. The lighthouse did not fear the wind. It simply continued its work. As midnight approached, Thomas spoke quietly. The sea changes. The weather changes. The world changes. But the light must remain. Elias listened carefully. Outside, lightning flashed above the ocean. For a moment, the cliffs and waves appeared bright as day. Then darkness returned. And still, the lighthouse shone. By morning, the storm had passed. The clouds drifted away. The sea became calm once more. Golden sunlight touched the cliffs. The village slowly awakened. From the lighthouse window, Elias looked across the ocean. The lantern had remained lit all night. The tower had stood against the storm, and the light had never failed. As he watched the peaceful sea below, Elias realized something. The strongest lights are not those that shine during calm nights. They are the ones that remain during the storm. Winter slowly settled over Avelune. The days became shorter. The nights grew longer, and the sea often rested beneath a silver moon. One evening, after the lantern had been lit, Elias stood beside the lighthouse window. The ocean below was calm. The wind had become gentle, and the stars reflected softly upon the dark water. Everything felt peaceful. As midnight approached, Elias heard something unusual. Far beyond the cliffs, somewhere across the sea, a bell rang. The sound was soft, slow, and distant. It drifted across the water like a memory. The old keeper looked toward the horizon. The bell rang again. Neither of them spoke. They simply listened. After several moments, Thomas finally spoke. "Many years ago," he said quietly, "sailors spoke of a bell far beyond these waters. Some believed it belonged to a monastery built upon a distant island. Others believed it came from an old lighthouse that no longer stood. And some said the sea itself carried the sound. No one truly knew. The bell had no answer, only stories. The sound continued to drift across the ocean. The sea remained calm. The lighthouse beam moved steadily over the waves. Elias stepped onto the narrow balcony. The moon illuminated the water below. The horizon stretched endlessly before him. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the distant bell rang once more. Soft, peaceful, almost comforting. Thomas joined him outside. For a long while, they stood in silence. Then the old keeper smiled. "Not every sound must be explained," he said. "Some things exist simply to remind us that the world is larger than we can see." Elias listened carefully. The words settled quietly within him, much like the sound of the distant bell itself. Eventually, the ringing faded. The sea returned to silence. Only the wind and the lighthouse remained. Yet even after the sound disappeared,
something stayed behind. A feeling, a mystery, a quiet connection between the cliffs and the endless ocean. And for many years afterward, on certain peaceful winter nights, the people of Avelune would still pause beside their windows and listen, hoping to hear the bell drifting gently across the sleeping sea. Several weeks after the night of the distant bell, thick sea fog once again began to gather around Avelune. It arrived quietly from the horizon. By evening, the cliffs had disappeared, the harbour was hidden, and even the lighthouse itself seemed to float inside a world of white mist. The villagers remained indoors. The fishermen kept their boats tied safely along the shore. Only the sound of waves and the steady turning of the lighthouse lantern could be heard.
That night, Elias climbed to the lantern room beside Thomas. The great light swept slowly through the fog. Again and again, the beam reached outward into the darkness, searching for anyone who might need it. As they watched the sea, Thomas suddenly pointed toward the horizon. Far away, barely visible through the mist, a faint lantern flickered. Then it disappeared. Then it appeared once more. A small boat was lost somewhere beyond the cliffs. Far out upon the water, an elderly sailor struggled to find the harbour. The fog had hidden the shoreline. The stars had vanished, and the sea seemed endless. His lantern burned weakly beside him. The waves moved gently around the small boat. Though he was not frightened, he had lost his direction. The world around him had become silent. Only the sound of water remained.
Elias carefully adjusted the great lantern. Thomas rang the old brass bell. Its sound drifted through the mist. The beam of light continued its slow journey across the sea. Patient, steady, faithful. For a long while, nothing changed. Then, gradually, the small lantern upon the water began moving closer. The sailor had seen the light, and he was following it home. As midnight passed, the boat finally appeared beside the harbour. The villagers who remained awake watched quietly from their windows. The elderly sailor stepped onto the shore and looked toward the lighthouse above the cliffs. He removed his cap and bowed his head. No grand words were spoken. None were needed. The light had done its work. Once again, it had guided someone safely through the darkness. Later that night, Elias stood beside the lantern room window. The fog was beginning to fade. The sea slowly returned. Thomas looked at him and smiled. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we never know who needs our light." Elias looked out across the quiet ocean.
Somewhere beyond the horizon, countless travelers sailed beneath the stars. And somewhere, someone might always be searching for a distant light upon the cliffs. The lighthouse continued turning above the sea, calm, warm, and endless. As winter slowly began to fade, the skies above Avelune grew clear once again. The heavy clouds disappeared, the sea became calm, and the stars returned to the night sky in all their beauty. Each evening, Elias climbed the lighthouse tower. The familiar lantern glowed warmly behind him. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, and above, thousands of stars shone over the dark water. The world felt peaceful once more. One quiet night, the sea became perfectly still. The waves rested. The wind disappeared. And the water reflected the heavens so clearly that it seemed another sky existed beneath the lighthouse. Elias stood upon the balcony and looked downward. The stars above and the stars below appeared almost identical. For a moment, it felt as though the lighthouse stood between two worlds, one of sea and one of sky. Thomas joined him beside the railing. For a long while, neither spoke. Then the old keeper said quietly, "When I was young, I believed the stars guided sailors." He looked toward the horizon. "But now, I think they guide everyone." Elias listened. The sea remained silent. The stars continued their slow journey overhead, and the lighthouse beam moved gently across the water. Later that night, Elias climbed to the highest window of the tower. The village lights below had grown quiet. Most of Avelune was asleep. Only the lighthouse remained awake. He looked toward the horizon, where the sea and sky became one. There seemed to be no beginning and no end. Only darkness filled with countless points of light. For the first time, Elias understood why Thomas loved the sea, and why he had devoted his life to the lighthouse. The stars above the ocean did not hurry. They asked for nothing. They simply remained. Night after night, season after season. Elias realized that the lighthouse was much the same. Its purpose was not glory. Its purpose was presence. To remain, to guide, to shine, even when no one was watching. As dawn slowly approached, the eastern horizon began to brighten. The stars gradually faded. The sea turned silver beneath the morning light. Elias stood quietly beside the lantern. The lighthouse had watched another night pass, another peaceful night above the ocean. And somewhere deep within his heart, he knew that he belonged here, between the sea, between the stars, and beneath the endless sky beyond the cliffs. The years moved quietly through Avelune. Seasons came and went. The cliffs changed with the weather. Winter snow covered the stones. Spring flowers returned to the hills. Summer brought calm seas. And autumn painted the coastline with gold. Through all these years, the lighthouse remained, and beside the old keeper, Elias continued to learn. The boy who once watched the light from the hills had now become a young man.
Thomas had grown older. His hair had become completely white. His steps upon the spiral stairs had become slower, and sometimes he paused to rest beside the windows overlooking the sea. Yet each evening he still climbed to the lantern room. He still cleaned the glass. He still watched the horizon. And he still rang the old brass bell. Elias began helping him more and more each day. Without speaking about it, both of them understood that time was changing. One evening, as the sun slowly disappeared into the ocean, Elias asked, "Why did you stay here all these years?" Thomas looked toward the sea. The lighthouse beam had not yet been lit. The sky glowed with soft shades of gold and blue. For a long time, the old keeper remained silent. Then he smiled. "When I was young," Thomas said quietly, "I believed I was keeping ships safe." He looked toward the harbor below. "But over the years, I learned something else. The light is not only for sailors. It is for anyone who feels lost." The waves moved gently against the cliffs. The wind passed softly through the tower. And the old keeper continued. "Sometimes people need to know that somewhere a light still shines for them." Elias looked toward the lantern. The great light slowly began turning above the sea. Its warm beam crossed the water exactly as it had for generations. Suddenly, he understood. The lighthouse was not simply stone, not simply glass, not simply fire. It was hope. It was comfort. It was a promise that even in darkness, someone remained awake. Someone remained watching. Someone remained guiding. That night, Elias stood alone upon the balcony. Above him stretched countless stars. Below him rested the sleeping sea. Behind him, the lantern continued to shine. For the first time, he no longer saw himself as a boy, learning from the keeper.
he saw himself as part of the lighthouse itself, part of its purpose, part of its light. And as the waves whispered far below the cliffs, Elias quietly realized that one day the keeping of the light would become his own. Time had moved gently over Avelune once again. The sea was calm that evening. The cliffs stood still beneath a soft golden sky. And the lighthouse, as always, waited above the ocean. But something felt different. A quiet heaviness lingered in the air. Elias noticed it first, though he could not explain why. Thomas moved more slowly than before, and his eyes stayed longer on the horizon than usual. That night, after the lantern had been prepared, Thomas called Elias to the top of the tower. The wind outside was soft. The sea below reflected fading sunlight. The lantern room glowed in a warm, familiar light. Thomas stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "I will not always be able to climb these stairs," he said gently. Elias looked at him, not fully understanding at first. Then the meaning slowly settled inside him. Thomas walked slowly around the lantern. His hand touched the glass he had cleaned for so many years. He looked at the mechanism that had turned the light countless nights. "This light has been with me longer than most memories," he said softly. Elias remained silent. The room felt different now. Not sad, but deeply calm, like the sea before a tide changes. Thomas turned to Elias. His voice was steady. "From tonight onward, you will light it." Elias froze for a moment. The words were simple, but their weight was great. Thomas placed the lantern key into Elias's hands. It was warm from years of use, and it felt heavier than anything Elias had ever held before. As the sun disappeared behind the ocean, Thomas stepped back. Elias moved forward slowly. He cleaned the glass. He checked the oil. His hands were careful, just as he had been taught. Then, with a quiet breath, he lit the flame. The lantern awakened. Warm golden light filled the room, and the great beam began its slow turning above the sea. Thomas watched in silence, and for the first time he did not need to guide the light himself. That night, the lighthouse felt different, not because it had changed, but because something within its keepers had. Thomas stood beside Elias for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The sea below moved gently. The stars above began to appear, and the light continued its endless journey across the water. In that quiet moment, both understood the same truth. A light is never truly owned. It is only passed on. After that night, Thomas no longer climbed the lighthouse stairs every evening. He still visited the tower sometimes. He still sat near the base and listened to the sea. But most of the work had become Elias's responsibility now. The old keeper did not speak much about it. Instead, he simply watched and listened, as if trying to understand the sound of time itself passing through the cliffs. Elias slowly adapted to his new role. Each evening, he prepared the lantern alone. He cleaned the glass, he checked the oil, and he lit the flame as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The lighthouse beam continued its steady movement across the ocean, night after night, just as it always had. But now, it carried a new meaning for him. It was not just duty anymore. It was trust. One calm evening, Thomas climbed the stairs one last time. Slowly, carefully. Elias did not stop him. When the old keeper reached the lantern room, he stood quietly beside the light. He watched the beam turn across the sea. Then he smiled. "It is still beautiful," he said softly. Elias nodded. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. As night deepened, the wind outside became gentle. The ocean reflected the stars once more. Thomas sat near the window for a long time. Elias stood beside the lantern. The light passed over the water again and again. At one moment, Thomas closed his eyes, not in sadness, but in peace. Before dawn, Thomas quietly left the lighthouse. No ceremony followed him. No crowd gathered. Only the sound of waves remained. Elias found the empty chair by the window when morning arrived. The lantern was still warm, and the sea was calm. It felt as if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. That evening, Elias climbed the tower alone again. The wind moved softly across the cliffs. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath the sky, and the lighthouse shone as it always had. But now he understood something deeper. The light did not belong to Thomas. It did not belong to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever looked toward it in the dark. And even though the keeper had left, the light had stayed. Years passed over Avelune like quiet waves touching the shore. Nothing in the village changed suddenly. Everything changed slowly. Children grew up listening to the sound of the sea. Old stories became familiar memories. And the lighthouse continued to stand above the cliffs, watching the ocean without rest. Elias remained there, not as a visitor anymore, but as the keeper.
Elias had grown into the role completely. He knew every sound of the tower, every step of the stairs, every rhythm of the lantern. Each evening he lit the flame without hesitation, and each night the great light moved across the sea just as it always had. Fishermen trusted it, travelers followed it, and the village slept peacefully beneath its glow. Sometimes, when the wind was very calm, Elias felt the presence of the old keeper. Not as a voice, not as a figure, but as a memory in the silence of the lighthouse. He remembered Thomas's words. He remembered his patience. He remembered the way he looked at the sea without fear. And in those quiet moments, Elias understood that Thomas had never truly left. He had simply become part of the light. From the balcony of the lighthouse, Elias often stood and looked outward. The ocean stretched beyond imagination. No beginning, no end. Only movement, only distance, only time flowing like water beneath the stars. Sometimes ships appeared far away. Sometimes nothing moved at all. But the lighthouse continued to shine regardless, because the sea was always changing, and someone always needed a light to return home. One calm night, Elias stood alone in the lantern room. The light turned slowly behind him. The ocean below was quiet. The stars above were endless. He thought about everything that had passed. The boy who once watched from the cliffs. The keeper who taught him. The storms, the fog, the silence, and the ships. And he understood something simple. The lighthouse was never about one person. It was about continuity. A light that passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. Elias stepped outside onto the balcony. The sea wind moved gently around him. The beam of light stretched far into the darkness. Beyond the cliffs, beyond the horizon, beyond everything that could be seen, there was only the unknown sea. But it no longer felt frightening. It felt vast, peaceful, alive. And as the lighthouse continued to shine into the endless night, Elias stood quietly and watched, knowing that as long as the light remained, no one would ever truly be lost. And now the lighthouse grows quiet once more. The waves continue their gentle journey below the cliffs, and the lantern still shines softly across the sea. As the night grows deeper, allow yourself to rest, let the worries of the day drift away like the tide. Thank you for spending this peaceful night with Eldermere Nights. If you enjoy these relaxing bedtime stories, please subscribe and join us again for another quiet journey. Sleep well, dream softly, and may the lighthouse always guide you home.